I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Kia Cerato GT. It's probably a car you've seen a lot of on Australian roads, usually in either white or grey, because the majority of Cerato sales are in fleets, so they're usually rental cars or cars for business. But we want to find out today whether the Cerato has something to offer for the private buyer at the top end of the spectrum. So this is the range-topping GT variant. It's pitched as a sportier, more, fun and fizzy variant of the car, and it's got some pretty substantial differences to the lower end models that make it a much more tasty proposition. So we're going to get into that in a minute, but what I want you to do before we get there is let me know what you think of the Cerato's look in the comment section down below. I think it looks much better here with the sportier grille and some bigger wheels. While you're down there, we'd love it if you could hit subscribe and the bell icon to help us on our way to 50k and beyond. And now we're going to get inside the Cerato and see what it's like. Into the front seat of the Kia Cerato GT, and it's actually a fairly pleasant place to be. There's a couple of really nice design flourishes to do on the dashboard. There's some quite expensive looking aircon vents. The general interior ambience is quite nice, if a little dark. Now you've actually got soft touch up here on the top here. You've got some soft touch down here. It does go to hard material down in the center bin. And there's also a slightly strange inclusion of a plastic armrest cover versus the leather wrapped steering wheel and gear knob, which it does kind of erode how nice the car feels. There's a leather pad to the armrest on the driver's side and soft touch materials. So yeah, the plastic just feels a bit odd here. For extra sporting characteristics, you've got some carbon fiber inlays as well. Now, the seats themselves are not particularly comfortable for my body, but they are leather appointed, heated and cooled, and they're electrically adjustable with memory functions, which is really impressive considering how much this car costs on offer. Currently, they're on offer for $33,990, which is crazy that you get heated, cooled memory seats for that money. Now, in front of you, you have a set of analog dials with a 4.2-inch TFT readout that is configurable and shows you all some information and allows you to adjust your driver assist programs and other stuff in there. Ahead of me here, I've got an 8-inch touchscreen running the software that you find in pretty much every Hyundai Kia, all the way up to a $90,000 Genesis, which for this car is a positive thing, perhaps not so for that Genesis. But in here, you've obviously got a shortcut button, you've got navigation on this GT variant, and you've also got your Apple CarPlay and Android Auto features as well. And yeah, it's nice and responsive. Shortcut buttons all down here, and you've got power adjustment here. The GT line also gets a JBL stereo, which sounds fine, and some decent amount of storage. So you've got this little tray up here for your smartphone. In the GT and Sport Plus variants, you get wireless charging as well. You've got a second tray down here with a fast charging USB port, and you've got some decently sized cup holders, door bins, and the covered central storage. So all in all, the front seat is a pretty nice place to spend time. What about in the rear quarters of the Cerato GT? Into the rear quarters of the Cerato GT, and there's some pretty positive things certainly about the space back here. Now, behind my own driving position at 6'2", my knees are just brushing the seat in front, but obviously that's a pretty extreme scenario. I've also got a fair amount of toe room. My feet can slide under there quite nicely, and my headroom is just brushing the ceiling, so that's pretty impressive in my book. Now, as for amenities back here, you've got a couple of things, starting with a little cargo net behind the passenger seat. There's none on the driver's seat. You've also got a flip down armrest, which has 2 cup holders already deployed for you. That's a nice leather item. Feels all right. You've also got air vents. They are only on the 2 top spec Ceratos, though. You don't get those across the rest of the range, which seems a little bit nickel-dimey to me. As for storage, you've got a little bottle storage in the door pockets here. Materials do go to hard touch in the back, though the carbon fiber strike does continue through. You've got a padded armrest on this side though, so it's all in all pretty nice back here. And the squab is quite inclined backwards, so it's a comfortable place to sit for me for fairly short periods of time. So let's see how practical the boot is for the Cerato. Coming around to the rear of the Cerato, and practicality abounds. But before we get to that, the GT has a couple of cool touches. It's got LED signatures on the tail lights, and you've also got this quite cool, like old school Euro style heck blender little detail, which is coming back. You've also got a little lip spoiler on the boot here. Now, popping that boot, manually operated, you would expect that at this price, and you've got a heap of space back here. The sedan has 506 litres of boot space, which is frankly huge. You've also got a space saver rear tyre in there. Unfortunately, there's very few amenities, like there's no shopping bag hooks or really any kind of cargo netting or anything like that, which is a bit of a shame because stuff definitely rattles around in that deep boot. But you can drop the rear seats by pulling these two little levers, one on each side, and yeah, it's a practical vehicle. So close the boot lid of the Cerato sedan, and overall it's actually not a bad looking car back here. Of course, if you prefer something like a hatch, they do offer that as well, a little bit more rounded, but I personally think that looks a little bit awkward. Now, let's hop inside the Cerato GT and see if it's as sporty as its intentions suggest. So, out on the road in the Kia Cerato GT variant. Now, as I alluded to before, this car is actually substantially different from the rest of the Cerato range. It's the only car that gets independent rear suspension. It's the only car that departs from having a 2-litre naturally aspirated engine as well. So everything up to the Sport Plus in the Cerato range gets quite an old school 2-litre naturally aspirated engine, which kicks out 112 kilowatts and 189 newton meters. And it's a fairly anemic little engine. It's not a super heavy car, the Cerato. It's about just a bit over 1,300 kilos. But the GT improves it massively with the 1.6 litre turbocharged engine. It's a much newer unit and it kicks out 150 kilowatts and 265 newton meters in Kia's guise. It's the same engine as you'll find in the Hyundai N-Line or the previous SR it was called before. And it's a nice little engine. It's very heavily used across the range. The tone is fine. It's a bit funky. Yeah, it sort of sounds like someone's playing a kazoo at low RPMs, which is a bit odd. But with the drive mode selection in this car, you do actually get to be able to sort of modify that a bit to quite a throaty intake noise. Now, it's all fake, and we'll give you a little run now, but it's kind of, yeah, it's a bit odd. It's definitely very fake, and it's quite loudly fake. The drive modes then kind of brings me on to my next little criticism of this car, and that is the drive modes themselves. Now, in Smart and Comfort are the two sort of normal drive modes that you access by the drive mode button here. So we're in Comfort, Eco and Smart. Eco is probably best left alone because I find the throttle response and the gearbox response to be just, doughy and unpleasant. Comfort is fine, and Smart seems to be the best balance because it lets you take control of the paddles and keep it in manual mode while you're driving, which is quite nice on a twisty road, and it also keeps the throttle response fairly consistent. You do get a nice long throttle, and it's adjustable, which is good. Sport mode makes it so artificially sharp that I find it really unpleasant to use. It's like the first 10% of throttle travel is about 40% of the engine's power, and then you really get nothing until the last 10%, again, where you get another kick. And yeah, it just makes it a bit difficult to drive and makes the car feel spiky. I assume it's for, like, it feels fast when you first get into the car, but then you realize it's not that quick. There's no adaptive suspension either, and that brings us on to the next point. Now, I did mention that this is the only Cerato in the range with independent rear suspension setup, so it's a multi-link suspension setup in the rear, and while you'd think that would make the car more comfortable, it does do away with some of that torsion bar slap that you can hear in the lower grade cars, but the GT is specifically tuned to be quite a sporty variant. And that leads to quite a harsh ride around town. So below 60 k's an hour, I find the Cerato to be verging on quite uncomfortable. And that's a combination of stiff springs and dampers and quite a large set of 225/40 ZR18 Michelin Pilot Sport 4 tyres, which have a stiffer sidewall because they are a high performance tyre anyway. And that 40 series sidewall is a little bit thin. So below 60 k's an hour for me, it feels quite harsh, especially over speed humps and expansion joints around the city. It can be a little bit taxing, especially in the rear seat, because it's quite stiff in the rear seat. And that is all obviously to do with how this car handles. Now, I'm not going to say it's as good as an i30N or Focus ST or anything like that, like a proper hot hatch, because it isn't. It's still lacking a little bit of that sharpness, a little bit of that fizz and the bubbliness that you get from those cars. But the chassis is really talented, and as you push on, you find that the Cerato actually, with a nice set of tyres, has quite reserves of, you know, refinement in its handling. The front end is quite well planted, the steering is a bit vague. I definitely, back to drive modes again, definitely think that the smart/comfort alternative is the best, because sport is artificially heavy and sort of a bit sharp. But as you start to drive the Cerato harder and lean on its front end, it adopts a really nice four-square neutral stance on the road. You can feel it working the grippy tyres nicely, and to me that's quite impressive, especially given the space on offer in this car and the length of the wheelbase, because it's really long. So the fact that it's got any dynamism in it at all is, yeah, big credit to Kia on this. It's fun. The transmission though is a little bit slow. This car gets a 7-speed DCT from Hyundai. It's a little bit slow to respond to downshifts using the paddles, but you know, it's never going to be tuned as sharply as a proper sporting transmission. So on the whole, it's a pretty fun car to drive. So, safety features on the Cerato. Now this GT, naturally being the range-topping model, does get a fair few. That means you get adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, high-speed AEB with pedestrian and cyclist detection, and a full complement of 5-star ANCAP rating. Now, you can get that across the whole range, which is really nice to see in Kia's safety pack. So you can get the base model S car with a safety pack for as low as $22,990 when it's on special with a manual gearbox, which yeah, is a really impressive way to get a spacious and safe car. Because all the systems are relatively inexpensive, perhaps they don't work as well. For example, the lane keep assist is a little bit late to intervene and can be not great. Likewise, the adaptive cruise control is a little bit wondrous. It'll go 3 or 4 k's an hour above or below the speed you set, which is usually not too bad, but sometimes can be annoying when you're going down a long hill on a freeway and stuff like that. So keep that in mind when you're looking at the Cerato. But yeah, it's definitely a really impressive package from Kia. The turbocharged engine makes it a lot more tasty than the rest of the variants, and it's something worth considering if you're looking at a smaller class of car like the Mazda 2s and Volkswagen Polos, because you do get a lot more space for your money with the Cerato. So those are our detailed impressions of the Kia Cerato GT. It's a significant upgrade from the lower models in the range and brings a lot of cool tech and a fair bit of sportiness that, you know, a keener driver can enjoy with practicality of the Cerato body. Now let me know what you think of the Cerato down below. Do you like it? Do you own one? Have you had a good experience with one? Anything, let me know in the comments section. And while you're down there, make sure you hit subscribe and the bell icon. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.